Hi folks, and welcome back to Quarantine According to Eddie. It's about 4:15 on the 26th of June. It's really hot, and we're approaching the 4th of July quite quickly. And the 4th of July is when there's going to be a lot of easing up of lockdown restrictions according to the government. Social distancing is going to be reduced, more businesses are opening, pubs being the one that seems to be on a lot of people's mind. People can go into each other's houses more freely. So it feels like quarantine and lockdown is really easing up. It feels like it's time to wrap up these videos, and I think that the 4th of July is going to be probably the end of the Quarantine According to Eddie series. I'll keep making videos, of course, but I think this series, it's time for it to come to a close now. It's been good, but it's time to bring it to an end. So moral error theory suggests that all moral claims are false, and we have a good reason to believe that. And John Mackey suggested this based on two arguments. One is the argument from Queerness. Now, he uses the term queer in the parlance of the 1970s, when this was written, which meant strange or unusual. Obviously it's been redefined now, but that's the definition he's using. And what he's saying is that ethical standards, if they were to exist, would be so strange as an idea that it's more likely that they don't exist. We have good reason to believe that they don't, because we can't measure them, we can't experience them directly, and they'd have to exist almost like in a world of forms, wouldn't they? They'd have to exist in another realm as an objective moral standard, and that doesn't make sense. There's no evidence for it, so he says, no, they're too strange as an idea. We have good reason to believe they don't exist. But the other argument is the argument from disagreement, which kind of, they join together. And the argument from disagreement suggests, okay, well also, if these moral standards did exist, then we'd all be aware of them, and we should all agree with them, because we'd all be motivated internally to follow those moral standards. And there's a problem here in that, firstly, this is where it kind of joins up to the queerness. We should be perfectly motivated to follow morality all the time, but we don't. So we'd have to explain why it is that we don't, why it is that things stop us from following morals. But then it goes on to say that beyond this, this is the argument from disagreement proper, is that because people have different ideas of what's moral, surely that's evidence that moral standards just don't exist. Because if they did, we'd all follow them, we'd all be motivated to follow them in the same way, but we're not, so we have good reason to believe that the idea of moral standards is false, and therefore moral statements which always claim some universal application must also be false. And the final aspect that he adds to this is that it's not appropriate to refer to moral standards as being true or false. You could say, the King of France is bald. Now, the King of France could be bald, the King of France could not be bald. These are sort of the two initial options, but also, the statement in itself is based on false premises, because there is no King of France. And so, therefore, you have to accept the whole thing as false. And in the same way, if you make a moral statement like, this is right, this is wrong, you're essentially, what Mackey is saying is you're referring to moral standards that don't exist. You're sort of referencing them, but they don't exist. So you have to accept that your statement is just false. Because much like the King of France not existing, there is no perfect ideal standard to follow. So all in, it would suggest that there are no moral standards at all, and all moral statements therefore are false. There are, however, disagreements and those who challenge the moral error theory. Christine Korsgaard suggested that just because you cannot prove something tangibly doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So you can say that you can't prove that ethical statements are based on any kind of objective fact, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any objective ethical standards. Essentially, the argument that Mackey is making is self-defeating by saying ethical statements are so strange, and the idea of ethical standards are so strange, that we can't prove that there are ethical standards, therefore they don't exist. Well, you can't prove that they don't exist. You've just said yourself that we can't prove that they exist or don't exist. So to then go ahead and say all moral claims are false, it doesn't work. All you could say is that we can doubt moral claims, but it does not suggest that they are hard and factually false. And this kind of links into another argument which suggests that there is actually tangible evidence for some level of moral standard. It's just that Mackey is refusing to acknowledge it. So the fact that we do see trends of morality across people in different societies suggests that people are drawn to certain moral ideas. And although that could be challenged in and of itself, Mackey appears to be ignoring it, and by ignoring that, he's sort of undermining his own argument. He's making it very black and white, he's making it reductive. This links into Gilbert Harman's argument of explanatory impotence, the idea that we have moral observations, we observe them out there, and just because we can't explain them, we don't have the potency to explain them, doesn't mean that we just discount them. It suggests that this reductive approach goes against the empirical data that we're receiving, and therefore Mackey is making a mistake. Now, the ideal observer argument is one that's been around for quite a while. It was espoused by David Hume and Adam Smith, famous economist, who was roughly utilitarian in his thinking, but inspired essentially free market economics. And the ideal observer argument is that when trying to establish what should be done in a moral situation, one has to imagine what would a perfect observing force do in your place. So it's broadly utilitarian, in the same way that what would be the greatest good to the greatest number, but also draws on aspects of Kantian ethics as well to a degree, this idea of duty and the idea of moral standards that should always be upheld, and other theories beyond. But it's this idea that you have to put yourself in the position of an ideal observer, someone who knows everything that needs to be known about the situation, someone who is fair and even-handed, someone who understands all the intention, all the consequences. And so therefore, if you were to do that, then it essentially acts as a universal moral guide. If everyone thinks in that way, thinks, okay, what would a universal observer do? What would the perfect universal observer do? If everyone thought that way, then you've got a universal theory. It applies to everyone and everyone can think of it. But it's still subjective. It's not suggesting that there are objective moral truths. People still have to agree. So it's got this sort of strength that it sort of fits into a society, and that a society essentially, societies are basically a contract that you sign with everyone else, and it's like we have agreed rules, we have agreed ideas. And so you can have your universal observer for your society. It goes, okay, is this right? It's got some of the benefits of being able to draw on intent and consequences, but it doesn't rely on God. So it is an applicable theory for an atheist, but it doesn't just rely on teleology, like utilitarianism doesn't just rely on consequences, and doesn't just rely on deontology, so the intentions and the act itself, which you get in Kantian ethics. So, there are strengths there. Problem is, it opens up to all kinds of issues in terms of, well, firstly, this is a form of moral relativism. If every society is deciding its own thing, then can you tell another society how to do things? If morals are completely subjective, then surely that means they don't really have any meaning anyway, beyond essentially an emotivist approach of I don't like this. When you say that something is bad, killing is bad. It's essentially just, well, we don't like killing. Are you actually making moral statements, or are you just making a statement of preference? A response to that would be, does it matter? Does it matter if morals are essentially just a statement of preference? But that's a different question. Ideal observer theory is an interesting one, and it's a very universally applicable one, but it doesn't help us understand whether there are moral facts or not. Both of these theories seem to suggest that there are no fixed moral facts, but whereas Mackey's idea basically suggests that there are no morals, deal with it, the ideal observer theory at least gives us something to work with on a practical level. So, as usual, if you've got any questions or comments, please leave them. Thank you very much to the person who requested these videos. This video on these topics. I think it's a really interesting one. So I hope that you have as good a week as I've been having. See you next time.